So I know I said I wasn't going to read the whole chapter and just go over some highlights, but upon rereading this, I've highlighted almost everything. So I'm going to be reading about 80 to 90% of this chapter. I don't know about the next one. Probably not the next one because it has more stats and stuff, but we'll see how it goes. Anyway, Why Race Matters by Michael Levin. Chapter 1. So What? When I began writing in 1992, I foresaw battling strong taboos against discussing race differences in intelligence and motivation. Since that time, the topic has been made more accessible by a number of books. Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray's The Bell Curve, J.P. Rushton's Race, Evolution, and Behavior, Daniel Seligman's A Question of Intelligence, Dinesh D'Souza's The End of Racism, Jared Taylor's Paved with Good Intentions, Seymour Itzkoff's The Decline of Intelligence in America, and Stanley Burnham's America's Bimodal Crisis. Herrnstein and Murray, Rushton, Seligman, and Burnham discuss race differences in intelligence, while Taylor, although he offers no positive account of the current unsatisfactory state of race relations, clearly rejects racism as an explanation. D'Souza blames cultural relativism. Indeed, where I argue that race matters because it is connected with intelligence and motivation, the bell curve might be called Why Intelligence Matters, explaining the connection of intelligence to life outcomes. The reception of these books has been profoundly mixed. Some respectful attention, some disregard, much demonizing. Because if you talk about this stuff, you're a bad person. That's the only explanation. Race differences are still vehemently denied in most forums. Hearing them affirmed is not quite the shock it once was, but much remains to be said. This book seeks to sift what is sensible from what is confused in thinking about race, particularly but not exclusively as it concerns the United States. It's particularly, relevant to the United States because it's a mixed race society, which just never seems to go very well. I don't know why. It's just like oil and water or something. I don't know what it is. South Africa is another great example of what happens. It is strange that race differences should ever have been taboo, since human groups obviously do vary, for instance in skin color and facial features. No doubt differences in these merely physical qualities are easier to acknowledge than qualities of mind, which are felt to matter more. But behavior straddles the mind-body distinction. Thought, the immediate control of behavior, is controlled in turn by the patently physical brain. And since groups can differ in bone structure, they can presumably differ in brain structure, brain function, hormone levels, and other determinants of mental activity, or lack thereof. Indeed, it is recognized that human groups not only look but act differently. Asians are comparatively restrained. Rhythm is a more salient feature of Black than European music. These differences are usually attributed to society, but to seek to explain them is to admit they exist. If breeds of dog may differ in intelligence and temperament, there seems no reason evolution could not have differentiated human groups along similar lines. As the accumulating evidence has made group differences harder to deny, one is apt to be told that even if they do exist, they do not matter. Psychologist Robert Sternberg dismisses black-white differences in intelligence with a curt, "So what?" Pursuing the issue, he says, can only give comfort to those who would like nothing better than to hear the explicit message that blacks will have a greater handicap in the educational, occupational, and military assignments that are most highly correlated with measures of general intelligence. Noam Chomsky writes, "The relation, if any, between race and intelligence has little scientific importance. A correlation between race and mean IQ, were this shown to exist, entails no social consequences except in a racist society in which each individual is assigned a racial category and dealt with not as an individual in his own right, but as a representative of this category. We are left with little, if any, plausible justification for an interest in the relation between mean IQ and race." That's a little disingenuous. Christopher Jenks is less combative and more open-minded about biologically based race differences, but he too waves aside their, quote, political importance. He says, "A correlation between genotype and school performance has no clear political implications. Knowing that migraine headaches are often inherited does not tell us whether they are treatable. Just as with test scores, I conclude that genes do influence criminal behavior, but just as with test scores, I also conclude that this fact is politically neutral." How on earth could you possibly arrive at that conclusion? If one race is genetically more criminal, that has no political... Okay, whatever, bro. All right. This book seeks to answer the so what question. It argues that race differences, far from being neutral, undermine almost everything that has been said about race for the past 60 years, and the many policies based on this conventional wisdom. Much is now known about racial variation, but it remains to put this knowledge in a broad philosophical perspective. That is what I have attempted to do. The importance of race differences is evident at an intuitive level. Whether fear of black crime is legitimate depends on whether blacks do in fact commit more crime. And, if they do, why? Whether black poverty and academic failure are the fault of whites, and therefore impose compensatory obligations on whites, perhaps to be discharged by racial preferences, depends on why blacks fail. Received opinion not only ascribes black difficulties to oppression, black attainment is so far below white that, if blacks are as talented as whites, oppression seems the only explanation. And for decades, just this conclusion has been drawn. And I'm sick of it. And a lot of us are sick of it. The topic of racial variation is admittedly disturbing, and in an ideal world might be passed over in silence. But accusations against whites have made such discretion impossible. We're not just going to shut up and let you blame all of your problems on our nasty, evil, racist, supremacist, bad character. The right of the accused to present his case includes the right to raise issues that distress his accuser. A plaintiff demanding damages for a broken leg cannot at the same time demand that his leg not be talked about, nor take offense when the defendant presents evidence that the injury was congenital. From birth, for anyone who's not familiar with that word. By claiming harm, he opens the question of why his leg is lame. Claiming racial harm has opened the topic of race differences. More than issues of justice warrant concentration on black-white differences. Fairchild, Weissman, and Wyatt ask rhetorically why less attention is paid to white and Asian differences, but granting this discrepancy, the reason is clear. Most white-Asian comparisons flatter Asians, while the direction in which black behavior differs from white is, by common consent, problematic. The black illegitimacy rate, always many times that of whites, has risen sharply in the last 30 years to nearly 70%. 42% of black children live in poverty. 56% of black households are headed by women, fewer than half of whom are self-supporting. Who is supporting them then? Blacks commit over 50% of the murders in the United States, and over 60% of the robberies because of racism. Comparable disparities exist at all levels. A black college student is 4.2 times more likely than a white to be enrolled in a remedial course. Editorial writers list, quote, crime, drugs, education, and a squeeze on the middle class as contemporary urban crises, literalizing journalistic euphemy. Drugs refers mainly to the chaos and violence attending narcotics in black slums. Education, mainly to the low levels of achievement and order in schools with large black enrollments. And urban crises, to all these phenomena together with the physical decay of cities with sizable black populations. A disproportionately white middle class is squeezed by taxation for services such as welfare, emergency medical treatment in public hospitals, and public schools, used disproportionately by blacks. On average, 20% of tuition at major colleges is used as aid for poorer, predominantly black students. Overtly race-neutral problems often have a tacit racial dimension, one with incalculable consequences for health, safety, and the habitability of cities is the growing cohort of urban derelicts. Although this is seldom stated openly, the median homeless person is a single black male. According to one survey, 91% of adult homeless in New York are black or Hispanic. According to another survey, 94%. Explanations abound for the emergence of this cohort, but one neglected factor is black illegitimacy. The number of black males who have difficulty supporting themselves in cities is large to begin with, for urban life, unlike rural, requires money, which in turn requires a steady income. In the country, a man with limited skills may own land on which to grow food, and get by bartering odd jobs for other goods. In a city, his skills must be marketable. White incompetents are generally cared for, directly or indirectly, by their families, whereas illegitimate urban blacks usually have no families. A 20-year-old male unwilling or unable to sell his labor cannot be helped by an unmarried, unemployed 35-year-old mother with other children and possibly grandchildren. He comes to live in public areas, surviving by begging and scavenging. Supporting the hypothesis that loose black pair bonding and a mismatch between black abilities and self-sufficiency in cities contribute to vagrancy is the fact that the homelessness phenomenon emerged within 2 generations of the large black migration from the rural South to the urban North, and within 1 decade of the jump in black illegitimacy in the 1960s. Homelessness is a further reason for interest in black abilities and sexual behavior. The basic argument for studying race differences is that racial outcomes are currently viewed through a lens of guilt, and it is important to know whether this lens is distorting. One result of racial guilt feelings already alluded to is the idea that blacks deserve compensatory preferences in employment and education. Another is use of a, quote, disparate impact criterion for bias, according to which a standard or practice discriminates against blacks if blacks do not do as well as whites with respect to it. The only explanation is racism and discrimination. No, there's a better explanation. Since whites usually do outperform blacks, seemingly rational practices are besieged throughout society. One example is the cancellation of the presumption of innocence by the 1991 Civil Rights Restoration Act, under which an employer accused of bias for hiring disproportionately few blacks bears the burden of proving that he did not discriminate. This use of numbers to create a presumption against the defendant is reasonable only if there are in fact proportionately as many blacks as whites in the workforce. That's a big if. Very big if. A striking application of disparate impact is the inference from the disproportionate rate of execution of blacks and killers of whites to bias in capital punishment. Such bias as exists could of course be ended by executing more whites and killers of blacks, which are usually black, rather than by ending capital punishment, the remedy usually proposed. But in any case, these statistical discrepancies show bias only if whites commit proportionally as many capital crimes as blacks and are no more frequently the victims of capital homicides. In fact, neither condition holds. To begin with, as already noted, blacks commit violent crimes at many times the rate whites do, and while half of all black crimes victimize whites, less than 3% of white crimes victimize blacks. Now suppose in addition that blacks are on average less empathetic than whites, hence more inclined to regard other people merely as resources or obstacles. Blacks will then be more inclined to kill, to overcome resistance, or silence witnesses during felonies, the sorts of murders for which the death penalty is often reserved. Suppose, too, that blacks react more violently to frustration, as impulsive, anger-driven murders in personal disputes are usually not capitalized. Relatively more blacks will be victims of non-capital homicides and personal disputes, which tend to involve members of the same race. Should proportionally more whites be killed in interracial robbery murders than in white-on-white personal confrontations, which we will see is evidently the case, the two rate discrepancies would be effects of race differences in temperament rather than bias. Duh. All right, that should be enough for you to think about for a little while. I'm not going to do the whole chapter in one video. I'm going to break it down into about 20-minute increments. So this is chapter 1, part 1. Yeah, we're sick of being scapegoated. If there's any racism, if there's any systemic racism in America these days, it's against white people. White people are so unracist that we're racist against ourselves to the detriment of our fellow whites. We're willing to handicap ourselves to make other races feel better. That's how unracist we are. But it's insane. We can't keep doing this. Because it's not even appreciated. We're still, no matter what we do, it's never enough. So, it's got to come to an end. Like this video. Eventually. All right. See you in the next one.